Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our colleagues and partners. Welcome to another session of the ASEAN DX Preparedness webinar series. My name is Sydney Yee, CEO of DXD Hub and co-chair of ASEAN DX Initiative. First and foremost, I would like to thank the panelists for taking the time to share their experience on this ASEAN DX platform. This webinar series is organized by ASEAN DX Initiative and supported by the National University Hospital Singapore, DXD Hub, ASEAN NDI, and ASAT Central. The ASEAN DX Preparedness webinar series is a platform for operators and practitioners to seed ideas and stimulate conversations on innovative solutions and alternatives so that we can better deal with this COVID-19 pandemic, which is far from over, unfortunately, and to prepare for what comes next. We have close to 700 registrations to this webinar. Judging by the vibrant discussions we have from the previous webinars, we look forward to having another exciting sessions on the topic of genomic surveillance. Before we move on, I'd like to go through some administrative details. This webinar is recorded, and the link to the recording will be sent to your email. There'll be a poll at the end of the webinar to help guide us in preparing for the next topics of your interest. Result of the poll will be made available on the ASEAN DX website. It is now my pleasure to invite Prof. Amin, Chairman of the Eijkman Institute for Molecular Biology, to open and introduce the webinar. Prof. Amin, please.
Thank you very much, Sydney. So very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, all speakers and participants. On behalf of ASEAN DX Initiative, I would like to first welcome all of you to this webinar series. In this time, we will discuss about genomic surveillance and referring to the genome surveillance. Next slide, please. Okay, we understand that, as mentioned by the WHO, that accurate and rapid characterization of public health risk of SARS-CoV-2 variants require combination of three activities: laboratory science, clinical manifestation, and also detailed epidemiologic investigation. And why we have to do virus genome sequencing? Because this is one of the three important strategic tools. Because by doing genome sequencing, it is possible to identify SARS-CoV-2 as a causative agent of COVID-19. And also we use the same tools to investigate its global spread. On the other hand, we could also use this technology to investigate outbreak dynamics, including changes in the size of epidemic over time, spatio-temporal spread and transmission routes, and also it could support the development of diagnostic drugs and vaccine. And the most important thing for vaccine is we could also use information obtained from genome sequencing to identify or to predict how the virus still could be controlled by the antibody produced by vaccination. And of course, the genome sequencing is, we understand, as a very important tool in reducing burden of COVID-19. Okay, we understand also that WHO has already characterized some viruses into variant of concern as well as variant of interest. And we understand also that there are some risk of variant of concern as well as variants of interest, variant of interest. Among others, those variants could have significant change in characteristics like increased transmissibility, also probably atypical clinical course. Maybe the symptoms are more severe, or there are more deaths from the cases. And also we observe that it's possible those variants will cause diagnostic failure. Yeah, in particular when we are using the nucleic acid amplification testing. And although it's also possible that the VOC and VOI could have decreased effectiveness of natural infection-derived immunity, and probably also those variants have decreased susceptibility to therapeutics. From the data we collected from GSAID, which is data actually contributed by all of us, we could see that the virus is spreading without, the virus recognized no border. Yeah, the virus could spread to anywhere. Yeah, from city to city, from country to countries. Yeah, in particular, as we could see from this map, the virus could spread easily from one country to another country in our region. And we could also study the characteristic of virus and also distribution, geographic distribution, and also from this fact we understand that genome surveillance is very important and also very strong tools to understand as well to develop science-based policy to control the pandemic. So by that, I would like to stress that the collaboration, in particular in genome surveillance in our region, is very, very important. Yeah, and even WHO also recommended data sharing among the countries. Yeah, because with the data sharing, we could maximize the attempt to control the pandemic. And I could share with you also that we have reported our activities to, for example, to our Minister of Health, and he supported very much our activities, and even he is planning to discuss this our activities to ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta for further observation and also follow up. So with that, I would like to conclude my speech, and I wish you all great time to in attending this webinar. Hopefully all the information we share in this webinar would be very, very beneficial to all of us. Thank you very much. I return to Sydney. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amin. Without further ado, I'll hand over to the chair and moderator of today's webinar, Dr. Benedict Yen, Director of the Molecular Diagnosis Center at the National University Hospital of Singapore. Ben, please.
Thank you, Sydney. Good morning, everyone. I will now start the presentation session. As we only have around 10 minutes per speaker, my introductions will be very short. So our first speaker is Professor David Hilliard, Medical Director for Molecular Infectious Diseases at ARUP Laboratories and a professor of pathology at University of Utah. He He will speak about the challenge of SARS-CoV-2 variant testing. Dr. David, please.
Thank you, Ben, very much for that introduction. If we can go to the next slide, you'll be directing the slide advancing. So this is slide 1, if you could go to slide 2. Great. Well, first, I'd like to thank you for that introduction and hello to the many participants in this program. I'd like to start by quickly going through some of the basics of COVID variants and also share our experience regarding the challenge of quickly standing up COVID sequencing. Next. The fundamental tool for identifying and understanding COVID variants is nucleic acid sequencing, which unfortunately has been a limiting resource, especially during this pandemic. Listed in the green bin are the essential needs of establishing initial viral origin and evolution, and understanding the virus's ability to change, tracking international and local spread of new strains in order to mitigate that spread, tracking individuals who may be initiating that spread, and predicting how quickly more dangerous variants will take hold. We also need to know whether new variants and subvariants will be confounded by existing diagnostic tests, as has just been alluded to. Perhaps most important at this time is the need to understand whether changes in variant sequence will confound vaccine efficacy, and to understand if variant changes will impact current and future therapeutics. Next slide, please. Last year, the CDC established a section of the COVID webpage which classifies variants. The nomenclature changed this summer, with variants being named based on timeline of emergence rather than location. So the UK strain is the Alpha variant, the South African strain is the Beta variant, the Brazilian strain is the Gamma variant, and the Indian strain is the Delta variant, as shown in the slide. Each of these variants are also classified as variants of concern based on clear evidence of increased transmissibility, more severe disease, significant reduction in neutralization by antibodies, reduced effectiveness of treatments or vaccines, or diagnostic test failures. Initially, the Delta virus was listed as a variant of interest, but current evidence clearly shows it to be a variant of great concern and potentially one of high consequence. As you can see, no variants are classified as such so far. Next slide. As you probably all know, the current pandemic situation in the US is daunting, to say the least, following what had been great viral suppression, at least in vaccination and mask-friendly states. ICU beds are now 70% full nationally, and although there are almost unlimited resources for vaccination and testing in the US, there's also a workforce crisis in healthcare and COVID testing personnel because so many people have simply gone back to work. And to top it all off, starting this summer, the Delta virus has almost completely replaced the Alpha UK variant in this country. The driver for this has been the virus's improved efficiency of infection and its higher viral loads in infected individuals. Next, please. The mechanism, let's see, I think we're, yes, okay, we're fine. The mechanism of these effects are due to COVID's error-prone RNA-dependent RNA polymerase spawning variants with changes allowing for high replication rate, as well as the forces of immune selection and subsequent fitness selection. On top of this are the different vulnerabilities to infection in host populations, particularly the immune suppressed. Next. Foundational mutations that have driven COVID spread for most variant strains are illustrated in this slide, with the well-known D614G, N501Y, and P681H mutations providing an early head start to highly efficient spread. Each of these mutations are associated with increased viral transmission and/or infectivity of respiratory tissues and reappear in new variants. Next. Up until this spring, the variant of greatest concern in the US has been the UK Alpha variant. In addition to the 501, 614, and 681 mutations just mentioned, it contains a 6 base pair deletion in codon 69 and 70, which has been associated with a 2-fold increase in infectivity and less potent monoclonal antibody binding. In addition, some but not all alpha strains contain an 484K spike protein mutation, which appears to have an impact on the host immune response and possibly vaccine efficacy. Next. The Delta variant has now been shown to be at least 40% more transmissible compared to the already fast-spreading Alpha UK variant. Akin to the UK variant, its L452R mutation affects ACE receptor binding, potentially affecting rate of spread. The much-studied P681H mutation creates a more efficient cutting of the spike protein than the related UK variant. We now know that the Delta B.2 variant has a shorter incubation period than the original B.1 strain. So individuals infected with the Delta virus test positive more quickly after exposure and shed more viral particles. They've also been shown to have viral loads approximately 1,000 times higher than the original strain, driving a faster person-to-person spread, accounting for very rapid initial spread in India and now worldwide. It's been speculated that rapid onset of symptoms provided an early warning of infection, and this played a role in the rapid fall of cases in India, at least after the first wave. Another speculation about this virus is that the high viral load will allow for greater sensitivity of detection by antigen tests during the asymptomatic period, although this is still under investigation and is a work in progress. Next, please. A critical and still unmet need is to find better ways to quickly and affordably detect COVID variants. Early last year, like many, we had no dedicated COVID sequencing capacity, despite our very, very large human genetics and cancer genetics testing capacities. In an effort to support our state lab, we reached out to an experienced sequencing group in Boston, Ginkgo Bioworks, which had offered their resources to support COVID sequencing. We started a project where we performed extraction of COVID positive samples and sent the frozen extraction plates to Boston, and within about a week received sequence data, which was also shared by our state lab, which at the time was focusing its limited capacity on critical outbreaks in nursing homes and meatpacking plants. That data from Boston provided an overview of the general spread of COVID in Utah until January of this year and the arrival of the UK strain, and constituted a major proportion of all total Utah COVID sequencing. It also provided a bridging capacity for the state lab, which, although well-equipped and experienced in strain typing, found itself vulnerable to supply chain shortages like almost every other sequencing lab in the country. However, that collaborative process, while effective, is not ideal, especially due to turnaround time. Another approach to variant detection is inclusion of targets for variant mutations in high throughput multiplex PCR tests. Many of you probably used one of the COVID flu A, flu B, RSV assays, which have shared floors for COVID targets and different floors for flu A and RSV. Likewise, variant detection and discrimination can be done without sequencing by targeting specific variant mutations with multiplex amplification tests. Several assays have now been developed that allow for detection of COVID in small numbers of mutant targets, as well as assays that just test for the mutant targets themselves. Next. A well-known example of this approach is the TACPath COVID testing with identification of S dropouts. Because of the impact of the UK virus last winter, much of our variant surveillance took the form of deletion identification, requiring only supplemental sequencing by our state lab. At that time, our high volume testing was with the Thermo Fisher assay, which targets 3 targets. The S target is usually the weakest of these targets, as indicated by the arrow on the top slide. In real-time PCR, the 6-nucleotide deletion basically destroys the S signal, as shown in the arrow below, resulting in an S target dropout with 2 other positive targets. Initially, most of the S dropouts that were seen in the US did not turn out to be the UK strain. And in fact, the first UK strain detected by Utah labs was actually a Wyoming patient that we identified by S dropout and needed to confirm as a true UK variant by sequencing in our R&D lab, followed by detection of several other early UK variants throughout the Western United States. Next slide. However, much like the United Kingdom, the US went through a transition of early entry of variants with mixed populations of deletion 6970 strains, rising with the alpha UK variants quickly becoming the dominant strain. Without going into details, quick identification of UK variants with the support of confirmatory and surveillance testing by our state lab allowed us to discontinue sequencing until the arrival of the Delta variant. Next slide.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, Dr. Hewitt. Time is almost running up.
Okay, very good. The use of multiplex PCR with fluorescent discrimination for variant detection relies on the identification of unique combinations of PCR targets that identify specific variant strains. This slide shows the convergence of mutations that, if targeted in multiplex test, would uniquely identify alpha, gamma, or beta strains. This approach has been used in a number of different formats to quickly and affordably identify COVID variants. And my last slide will be to point out that in addition to multiplex PCR with fluorescent discrimination, several other technologies are being used to identify characteristic mutations. One early paper demonstrates the use of MELD analysis, molecular beacons, to identify N501Y, present in alpha, beta, and gamma. Another report describes the use of fragment analysis to identify 3 mutations, plus the 6970, uniquely identifying the UK strain. And I think a really important test is current and ongoing versions of Agina's mass array, which is able to detect large numbers of mutations, specifically identifying 50 variants, including alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and its subtypes. At this point in time, this test can detect and discriminate all of the relevant variants and in a high throughput format. These tests are clearly not relevant to mutation discovery, and the most important approach to variant identification and characterization is, of course, sequencing, about which we will hear a lot today. So with this, I'd like to thank you for your time and hand the presentation off to the next presenter.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. David Hilliard, for the nice overview. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Safarina Malik, Head of the National Genome Center at the Eijkman Institute for Molecular Biology. She will speak about SARS-CoV-2 genomic surveillance in Indonesia. Over to you, Dr. Safarina.
Thank you, Ben. Let me share my screen. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer that have invited me to give this presentation. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about SARS-CoV-2 genomic surveillance in Indonesia. As has been mentioned by David earlier, that the Delta variant is increasing lately, and it's not only in Indonesia, it's also all over the world. And in Asia here, since the beginning of the rise of the Delta variant, it reached 18% total. But in June and from June to August, it has increased to 65%. While in Indonesia, with our samples that it's sequencing has been increased now, it's almost reached almost 90% of the Delta since June. So it's a very concerning matter. So if you will look at the the data is downloaded from 24 August. The cases itself is decreasing in Indonesia, and yet all of the, for example, this week, some of the institutions submitted the WGS samples to GISAID, and all of them are of Delta variants. So to be able to understand really what is going on with the circulating virus, we set the specimens criteria, specimen from travelers testing, positive upon entry to Indonesia, vaccine failures, reinfection, severe illness and death, outbreaks with unusual characteristics, long COVID-19 and cases in children, and also cases from remote area in Indonesia. As you already perhaps realize that we are not a usual country. We are island countries where regions are separated by seas, and it's not easy to send samples. And all of the facility, only one is located in Papua. The rest of the NGS facility are located in Java Island. So all samples has to be sent to Java. Okay. Our capacity, the Indonesian genomic surveillance capacity in 2020 is very, very low. We only submitted about 140 sequence with 130 sequence of whole genome sequence. And only a handful of institutions did the whole genome sequencing. But in January 2021, there was an initiative by the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Research and Technology then to collaborate together. The Ministry of Health is concerned about the health and the pandemic itself, while the Ministry of Research and Technology provide grants for the research itself. So they combine forces together and sign an MOU and implementation agreement. Because of that collaboration, now the number of sequence has increased a lot. As of today, this is from 24 August, but yesterday there are several hundreds, more than 100 sequence has been submitted from Indonesian institutes. So this initiative has initiated the formation of the Indonesian Genomic Surveillance Network, what we call Jejaring Surveillance Genome in Bahasa Indonesia. And that make us stronger, collaborating between institutes and communicating and also conducting workshops to improve each other. But if you can see here, how many samples that has been sequenced in Indonesia, it's unequal. For example, Maluku Utara or North Maluku here, when I access this, when I prepare this presentation, it's only one, but today or yesterday, it has improved because some of the samples has been sent to Jakarta to be sequenced. Also in Southeast Sulawesi. So if we look at the proportion of the how many genomes has been sequenced per cases. For example, if you look at the number, Jakarta is quite a lot, more than 1,000. But if you look at the cases, the proportion is only 0.16%, 0.16. And when you look at Jambi, it's only 359, but their cases are not as high as Jakarta. So it's quite high, the proportion. But for example, Gorontalo, it's still low. It's 0.03. So the inequality has to be troubleshoot. We have to find a way to collect samples and do the genomic surveillance in all over of these island nations. Otherwise, we will not be able to detect what is circulating within that particular area. So if we look at, this is the overall picture of what is being circulated, what kind of, what lineage it has been circulating in Indonesia from the beginning of our announcement of the first COVID-19 case in March 2020. If you can see here, the dynamic is that this is what I mentioned about the Indonesian lineage, and this is also Indonesian lineage occurring in November. But since probably in June, most of the variants that is being circulated in Indonesia is the Delta variant and its sublineage, the AY4. We don't have the A1, 2, or 3. Hopefully, not in the near future, hopefully. But these are all included in a Delta variant. So we have been working very hard to monitor and to also collect samples to see, is it really now dominated by Delta with no possibility of other variants to increase, or we could suppress the spread of Delta. But if we look into each province, Indonesia has 34 provinces. So for example, like this Bangka Belitung Islands, it seems that the Delta is dominating that area. And yet, because of the samples were only 6, it's bias. It's a biased conclusion saying that Delta is the dominant one. Like this, oh, there are three equal Gorontalo, three equal lineage circulating there, and yet it's coming from only 3 samples. This is Jakarta. You can see this. This is quite a variation occurring in Jakarta area because the sample size is quite, it's more than 1,000, and the sample size is enough to be able to draw conclusions that there are variations of lineages circulating in Jakarta, but Delta and its sublineage is dominating. We can say that. And for example, this is only one samples. That's why it's only have one lineage. And also this one, this is coming from 3 whole genome sequence. By chance, they have the same Indonesian lineage, the B14662. The red arrow, I will discuss this further. Like the West Sulawesi and North Sumatra. The West Sulawesi seems to have 3 types of lineage, while the North Sumatra has variations of lineages. Of course, the Sulawesi have 3 lineages only because the samples were collected in February, early February, after the earthquake, and people were collected. The samples from the subjects were living in a kind of center after the earthquake. They cannot stay in their own home. So they are refugees. That's why what lineage has been circulating is similar because they live close to another. While in Medan, for example, their cases are increasing. That's why the concern of the increasing cases in North Sumatra, not Medan, North Sumatra, Medan is the capital city of North Sumatra. We can say that the increasing cases is due to the rise of the Delta variant. As has been mentioned before by David, that the spike and the L452R and P681R is one of are 2 mutations that could cause the increased transmissibility, virus replication, and viral load. Because of that, the Delta is increasing. And there's a questions about how could you detect Delta if you don't have the capacity for whole genome sequencing, if you don't have the NGS machine. We have submitted a few weeks ago a paper giving a kind of a summary on how to detect only a Delta variant, but it still needs to be reviewed. It's still under review. That in if you are using the Sharit 2009 Berlin primers to detect the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it has a target of the RDRP. RDRP target within that area has a mutation in Delta variant. That's why the CT value is shifted. And we look at it that the CT value of the RDRP gene target and the E target, the E gene target, is has a 2 CT value different. That's why we calculate it, and because it's still under review, we cannot share the our result. But hopefully, it could be used in our in Indonesian remote area to detect that. If it is suspected to be the Delta variant, then they could send the samples to the center who has NGS machines, because sending samples is not easy. It needs this is island nations, right? So it needs to be preserved. It needs it costs quite a lot, etc., etc. That's why if they can do this first screening of whether it's Delta or not, then they could do it themselves in this remote area. So in summary, the WGS, the whole genome sequencing, can provide information on virus transmission and spread useful for surveillance. Our experience, we have experienced it ourselves, and WGS is useful for variant identification, which is needed to understand the emergence of potential new SARS-CoV-2 lineages. Genomic surveillance can provide important information for tracking of new SARS-CoV-2 variants lineages, and genomic surveillance can generate a rich source of information for tracking SARS-CoV-2 transmission and evolution, like in the Indonesian lineages, the B14662. It occurred in Indonesia, and it's circulating in Indonesia before the Delta variant take over the domination. Application of genomics and surveillance of COVID-19 highlighted its usefulness in the nearly real-time response to a public health crisis. Genomics data can assist and support public health programs for COVID-19. And I would like to acknowledge the Jejaring Surveillance Genomic Surveillance Network. We have worked very hard. These institutes work together to be able to support the genomic surveillance in Indonesia. And we also work together to find funding, because it's not, it's quite expensive to conduct whole genome sequencing. And also, I would like to acknowledge the team at the Eijkman Institute who has supported this activity. So we were able to do lots of sequencing. Eijkman Institute now has already submitted more than 2,000 whole genome sequence of the 5,600 sequence of Indonesia. So it's more than 1/3. Thank you. I think that's all, Ben.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Dr. Safarina.
Yeah.
Our third speaker is Dr. Anuraj Agrawal, Director of the CSIR Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology in Delhi, India. His talk is titled Pandemic Preparedness, Building Distributed Molecular Surveillance Capacity. Dr. Anuraj, please.
Thank you, Benedict. I think the speakers have already set the stage very nicely for what I'm going to talk about, which is how to build distributed molecular surveillance capacity. Something that's really important, you heard Safarina talk about the challenges of shipping samples across a series of islands to a point when the cost of shipping might become greater than the cost of sequencing at its lowest point. So India looked carefully at one of these very important communications out of WHO in how to design a genome surveillance program. You have to ask yourself, what is your diagnostic capacity? What's your capacity for physical sequencing? And what's your capacity for sequence data and analysis? I think sometimes that people don't think enough about. If you are not RT-PCR testing enough, you have areas of the country where RT-PCR tests are not happening, then no matter what is your physical sequencing capacity, you will not know the variants coming out in that part of the country. So before you plan a sequencing surveillance program, you must ensure that you have adequate diagnostic capacity testing program. After that, it comes to physical sequencing, and I will talk a little bit about the ways to distribute it. In the last part, and Sebastian is here on the panel, about sequence data analytics. Either you can do the analysis on your own. I mean, there is more to analysis than just lineage calling. Lineage calling is an important part, but not the only part. But you can today share your data. You can share your data as fast as possible with other people who may have more advanced analytics capacity. And today, with SARS-CoV-2, we have all learned the importance of sharing data, perhaps some of us more so than others. I would suspect that almost all of you who do large-scale sequencing are using something like COVIDSec. Nanopore can also be used for very large-scale sequencing. But fundamentally, what changed this time, that has never been done before, was barcoding of samples. So we had these massive sequencers used to generate terabytes levels of data for human genomic work. The problem was, how do you use them to do thousands of samples in one go? And the idea turned out to be simple. Create a nucleic acid sequence barcode, massively parallel sequence in these capable sequencers, and use analytics to separate each of the samples. And today, in my lab, and we were amongst the first to test COVIDSec globally, we can do 3,000 samples every run. It takes about 72 hours. Unfortunately, most of our library prep is manual. So practically it takes a week. But in theory, for a well set up lab, which had a high-end NovaSec, which had automation and had a very organized system of RNA coming in from a variety of places, you could easily get, using Dragon, turnarounds of 24 to 48 hours for 3,000 samples. That's a lot. You could get the same turnaround as Denmark has shown with the equipment I'm going to show you next, the nanopore. And for some reasons, nanopore is not widely used for, the most obvious reason is the inaccuracy per base week is significantly greater for nanopore. So it's not as good for human applications, but for viral work, it is a phenomenal little piece of equipment. Most of the Illumina machines are expensive, in our experience, a bit finicky. You need to have high quality air conditioning. You can't put them on the back of a van and take them to any part of the country that you want. If you were only planning to do 48 to 96 samples at a time, and this much is easy even with the smallest machine currently in the market from Oxford Nanopore Technologies, the MinION, it is about the size of a pencil box. It can be used to generate data within 24 hours. It has some problems with some parts of the viral genome, but by and large, there is practically no difference between this and an Illumina machine. And there is a latest one, which is not yet in the market fully, the SmidgeION. The SmidgeION will be the first sequencer that you can simply tie into a mobile phone. Only this lower part is the sequencer. That is a mobile phone. And that will be also a game changer. The reason I say this is the cost is so low. So basically, if I were to buy one of these machines for sequencing, I can create a ready-to-go lab for sequencing in less than $10,000. Now, for those of us who have shipping challenges, a large country, a difficulty already in getting testing going, forget about being able in a small country to ship hundreds of thousands of samples to a common point. It's important to distribute your sequencing capacity. And I'm going to give it by India's example and talk about the importance of what I said for a new variant. If you're only going to track lineages between variants, it's okay. You can ship everything to the center. A month later, you can find out what was happening. But if you were trying to find the next delta, you really want to cut down the time between sample collection, testing, and sequence generation. And I cannot see, at least in India, any way other than to move the sequencing out of only the big labs. Because if I get 3,000 samples at a run, it takes me a few days to extract the RNA, then prepare the library, and then shipping takes time. It's not terribly convenient. We were able just to show that we could put an entire nanopore-based sequencing lab into a container, transport it to the New Delhi airport, and start sequencing every RT-PCR positive coming out at New Delhi airport. This was in happier times when we thought the biggest danger to India was samples coming from outside India. Very soon after we set up this lab, we realized the biggest danger was well within India itself. So yes, right now we're not focused too much upon airports. Pretty much everything is Delta everywhere. But that is something important to keep in mind for the future. The world will not always be the way it is today. The last few points I would make: distribute your sequencing, fragment it up, have multiple stakeholders, but always centralized data. Be very flexible. If people want to sequence, people want to participate, your medical schools who have never sequenced before, they would like to actually become part of your sequence. Make sure the data comes together. Make sure the data comes together at a global level is the biggest message. Again, Sebastian is here. And India is also now very routinely submitting to GISAID. I think we have about 45,000 sequences now, Sebastian. And the total number with us is 50. So, the 5K gap comes because we also quality assure before we send it globally. And so India now has a program called INSACOG. And on my institute's website, you can find a portal. The web link is below. If you plug it in, you can see all the sequences as they come from a variety of the countries, state by state, lineage by lineage. It's interactive. You can type in additional lineages if you wanted to see them. You can see in India the rise of Delta. Delta is I always look back at this graph and ask myself, how much earlier could we have found it? We've started reporting a mutated strain somewhere around March, could have been done potentially in February. Not that much different, but if you were to look at a single sequence, one sequence of what turned out to be Delta was present in December. But then what can you do with one sequence? If you had sequenced more, perhaps that one would have been 100. If we were using advanced analytics and comparing L452R to the California outbreak, we would have said, okay, we see L452R. But even if we saw that, we would have said, okay, fine, L452 was it? How could we have known that this would go on to become Delta that is now spreading around the world? I don't have a good answer. Even today, when I look at all the mutations of Delta together, P681R, P478K, L452R, the three musketeers, so to say, you don't actually expect a virus that is spreading as fast as Delta has spread, because almost all of them had been seen before. None of them by themselves had been so devastating. So clearly, there's a lot to go in terms of basic science for us to better understand the next Delta. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dr. Anuraj. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Soebandrio, Executive Director of the Bioinformatics Institute in Singapore. His talk is titled Variants, What Makes Them a Threat? Sebastian, please.
Thank you very much, of course, for the invitation, and to all the previous speakers for the very good presentations. And I think I'll try to complement you by both zooming out into the global level of how we work all together in the GISET platform, but also go back to the detail to these questions. And I agree with Anurag, exactly what you said. We can see those mutations early, but we do not know if they take off. But that's exactly why the real-time genomics is very important. So let me go on. You see the general picture. You've seen it in several of the slides. The general epidemiologic situation is that the Delta variant here in light blue replaces the Alpha variant here in red. But and we also see that on all the continents except South America, where Gamma still has a little bit of a foothold, and Lambda is also there, but it's not really relevant. So I wouldn't worry about Lambda too much. But also Delta is rising there strongly. So we always look at this, but is this the full picture? You know, when WHO started to name based on the Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, this was not the beginning. Variants have already existed. And Dr. Safarina also showed the complexity of the picture of how in the here, this is the global map, the virus has always mutated. This light blue one was the Wuhan city outbreak. And there were parallel ones in southern China, here these blue ones. All these orange colored ones are actually the ones with the D614G that David said in the very beginning. And then there were subdivisions. The lighter one was the one that was more commonly found in the US. This one was more commonly found in Europe. And this pink one was one that happened when travelers last summer came back from vacation back into Europe, and it caused this spike. This is the Alpha variant, and this is the Delta variant. And you see, it didn't start with Alpha or Delta. And one interesting observation is you see a bit the speed of how fast there is a turnaround of variants. And it has been some climb here, but Delta has a much stronger one. So this maybe is one of the indications in how we should evaluate those variants. It's important to note that when this virus mutates, and David showed the mechanism because there is an error in the replication that makes mistakes in the virus. You can think of it that way. It only introduces tiny, tiny changes. You have 30,000 letters and you change just a few of them. And what you can actually compare it with is you still have the same virus and you just have a tiny change, like the license plate is different. And that's also one of the Achilles heels of the virus, because we know where and when a virus has been collected, and we have these license plate mutations, we can help it for contact tracing. We can study the transmission and the spread of the virus. So many of these changes, they do not affect anything in terms of the properties of the virus. They do not escape vaccine or make it more severe, but they have some founder effect markers like a license plate that help us to track it. On the other hand, unfortunately, like mentioned by my colleagues, there are also some mutations that do change the virus. And again, those are just tiny changes. You can compare it with, they do affect, let's say, the engine size of the car. From the outside, you only see there is an indication, for example, the volume of the engine, so that it's a stronger engine behind. But it nevertheless is a marker that with genomic surveillance, we can use as a proxy to try to understand which of the strains are more serious than others. And so what is needed to detect and monitor these variants? All of you have shared genomes with everyone else in the world. And most of them are happening through the GISAID platform. And it is a trusted sharing mechanism. GISAID in Indonesia has a long history from avian influenza. And was also shown by Eijkman Institute, there was a great contribution from Indonesia. India as well, with Anurag contributing now too. And what you need is the whole world working together. There is 192 countries and territories that have already submitted SARS-CoV-2 genomes to GISAID. And then, of course, you also need to enable to look at them. And right now, globally, we have 3 million submissions already. And if you go to the GISAID webpage, you can find some information about submission statistics, but also tracking of variants. And for ASEAN, since we are here in the region, it's interesting to see Indonesia is the country that has generated and shared the most genome sequences. And this is greatly thanks to the Eijkman Institute as well. Of course, there are different turnover times. Real-time surveillance benefits greatly from these new technologies that also Anurag said, from nanopore, and you get genomes from all over the place. And it's important to have those coming in and flowing. And there are a plethora of tools developed by many people, some also from our institute, that allow to look at this. There are the phylogenetic trees. Dr. Amin was showing the tree for the ASEAN region, for example. Then there are tools that allow checking for mutations in primer sites, so there was a question in the chat. And we're also looking at emerging variants. For example, we are able to say when a mutation occurs in the virus genome, where is it in the structure? And in the structure, we also know where a relevant region. Is it near the receptor binding site? Is it near the antibody binding region? Or is it near some of the other cleavage sites? So there are some tools that are directly connected to the sequences that enable the public health labs to make some assessments. And it's always much easier to say in retrospect, and there is really nothing that you can predict fully ab initio. But an early picture of the Delta variant with this whole setup, with global sharing of genomes with analysis tools available, looked like this. So this was the precursor B1617. This is the time frame in April. Like Anurag said, there were earlier cases, but the first larger number of cases were around this time. But having these tools available, both the phylogenetics and the structural analysis, we were able to see that there was something different. But at this time, it's very difficult to see if this is the new one that is going to take off. Nevertheless, this has been discussed across colleagues, in SARCOG, in the network, etc., with early phase of the outbreak. And but at that time, no one would have known that it would reach more than 90% so quickly. Nevertheless, we know that we can understand part of it. We know that what makes a virus successful depends on changes in the receptor affinity, something that makes it bind better to the host cell, and this becomes more important after many natural infections as well as high vaccination rates, antibody escape. We know there are additional sites in the spike protein of the virus that is on the outside that then allow it more easily to escape the vaccine. Vaccine still always is the best option. It will protect you from more severe disease. It will reduce transmissions. And there are other features of the virus spike protein, like stability of the virus particle, cleavage efficiency to enter host cells, that all together make a virus more successful. So we do know the toolbox of the virus, and together with genomic information, if a strain suddenly becomes on the rise, we can try to predict which one could be more interesting. And this is commonly done. This is done by World Health Organization, Virus Evolution Group, Public Health England, and many other too. And having this combination of sequence to structure, as well as global epidemiology, global sampling, does give us some at least early warning that something is happening. But I wouldn't worry too much, because as you could see from before, most of the time these variants actually do not cause anything different for the virus. So it's much more important to focus on what can be done on the human side and the vaccine side. And if a variant occurs like it did for Delta, then this genomic surveillance is an important tool to help tracking it throughout the world. And you can also access this on the GISAID webpage, for example. And what you see there is the summary of the data from all these great efforts from the sequencing labs, like the Eijkman Institute, like CSIR. And there are also sub pages where you can see more detailed views of specific regions. And for the global picture, you can go to GISAID, for example. And I want to summarize quickly that the flow of sequences has been unprecedented, but it has also been very much enabling our responses. From the first vaccines, the creation of the vaccine itself needed the sequences, but the understanding of the virus, how it changes from Utah to Indonesia to India, all of this is a global collaboration and requires all of our help to work together. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Sebastian. So our final speaker is Ms. Anita Suresh, Head of the Sequencing Program at FIND, the Global Alliance for Diagnostics. She will speak about resources and tools for genomic surveillance capacity building. Anita, please.
Thank you, Benedict. And so thank you to the organizers for having me on this panel. And it's fantastic to go after this very eminent panel of experts, because they've given all of the background and all of the experience from the ground, which is what really shows how much has been done, how much work has been done in terms of genomic surveillance, but how much some of the gaps as well that still exist. So I really want to highlight from our side more some of the tools and resources we work on or find helps to bring into play to support some of this. And a lot of it is also collaborations with some of even the organizations on this panel. And if we don't already work together, I would love for an opportunity to talk to collaborate. So just a little bit for those who are not as familiar with FIND. FIND is a global alliance for diagnostics. Our role is to essentially enable diagnostics for all. So we connect countries, communities, donors, decision makers, policy makers, and so on to really, and also of course the manufacturers of diagnostics and technologies, medical technologies, to essentially get the innovation, really get it to where it matters, to the low and middle income countries, and to help to integrate them and build up the sustainable and scalable solutions that work with the health systems. Little bit on FIND, really, we're established initially as a product development partnership, but a lot more increasingly we're doing not just product development, but the delivery, the access as well. And relevant to this topic is essentially FIND is also a co-convener of the ACT-A, or the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, and the diagnostics pillar specifically. We are also a collaborating center of the WHO for lab strengthening and diagnostic technology evaluation. So some of the work that we're doing really is in line with that, where if it's sort of putting into practice or enabling some of the work that what the WHO has put into place, the frameworks and so on, then developing sort of tools that can help you utilize those frameworks in the right way, which I think some of the country partners have already shown in their talks. And again, of course, we do a lot of the clinical studies as well, so a lot of the evaluations for the early diagnostics and so on to get PQ, to get the qualifications, to get the emergency use authorizations and so on from WHO, were also work that we helped to facilitate. So when I really go into the sequencing program as such at FIND, I think the work I wanted to more speak on was our anchor project was really on TB, as I think other attendees have pointed out. Obviously, sequencing is used for so much. It's been used heavily even before COVID, but I think COVID has really brought it to the forefront in terms of why it's critical, why it's needed in a global way, and why it needs to be part of public health systems and really integrated with public health systems, be it both for surveillance, but eventually also for diagnostics, depending on the disease. So in the case of TB, for example, there's a lot of work in terms of the drug-resistant TB diagnosis that we work on to get WHO policy on the use of sequencing for DRTB diagnosis. It's also, of course, used in surveillance. We've worked on global mutations catalog, knowledge bases, and so on, to essentially, again, very similar concept, borrowing a lot and also collaborating with GISAID on some of this to see how this whole concept of the data sharing, being able to utilize that to glean useful information and to actually be able to drive either public health action in the case of surveillance or even diagnostic action in the case of patient management. And really taking all that together into knowledge sharing packages and tools that countries can use and country programs can use to integrate this well into their systems. Other areas we work on, of course, are more from the AMR sequencing side, and also the use of sequencing in various other diseases. So viral hemorrhagic fevers as well, that's been used a lot. So in Ebola, Lassa, yellow fever. And so some of the products, sort of outputs that we've had have been a lot of sequencing technology landscapes. So in the end, I will definitely have a link that points you to you can find it on our website. Essentially to really cover the gamut of what is being done using sequencing, what are the tools, technologies, things that the speakers alluded to, really a sort of a global picture of what is available, what is missing, what are the gaps. So that's useful in a way for developers, for donors, for countries as well to start planning to say, hey, these are being done well in certain countries. What can we learn from this and how can we utilize this in our settings? And really coming down to the COVID aspect, as I said, a lot of the work is as part of this ACT-A genomic surveillance. So what was one of the new things that came out earlier this year, and some of the panelists are members of this, was there's a need. Clearly there's diagnostics, there's therapeutics, there's of course the vaccines pillar, the whole COVAX and so on. There's clearly a need for this whole genomic surveillance almost as a dedicated working group to be able to see some of the three things that really came up as themes from this talk, right? So also that coordination, so coordinating the efforts, sharing, be it data, best practices, or just collaboration, sharing of learnings. And then the third being support again being in kind or funding support. So really the goal from this working group and really what FIND does is to be able to bring some of these to bear. So be it the coordinating these efforts, coordinating investments, in some cases it could be collaborations where we could contribute in a way, provide technical assistance, and then all partner with on the ground folks to do the training, capacity building, personnel training, and so on. So essentially some of the work within this COVID-19 aspect that we have within the sequencing program, again, the initial basis for a lot of the disease areas is that NGS technology landscape. It really helps us to see what is the big picture of what is available, how it's being used, and really starting well before the variants even came into the picture. As the speakers alluded to, really the sequencing, the first sequence was so important to be able to even identify the virus, and then eventually to design diagnostics, design vaccines, therapeutics, and so on. So the utility of sequencing is well beyond sort of just the tracking of the variants, and hence sort of how that has evolved and how it can broadly be utilized for all of these aspects during a pandemic. So COVID-19 being one, but obviously the use of something like a tool like genomic surveillance and a tool like sequencing goes well beyond this pandemic. It really should be about building this, future-proofing this for country health systems for anything that happens in the future, and also for normal overall health systems usage in terms of managing patients as well as the overall disease surveillance initiatives. So the other aspect we've done along with India has been an online training for SARS-CoV-2 sequencing. Again, very not as highly technical as some of the groups have been doing, of course, but this was more because there's so much interest now in this to ensure there's at least a baseline level of knowledge that's shared among the groups, among labs that are interested in starting sequencing programs, and then be able to supplement this or complement this really with in-person training depending on the countries and so on, what is being organized within countries or within regions. And the other aspect, as I mentioned, is this technical consultation. So this is very much almost a case by case. So based on specific countries, specific donors, being able to work out either a collaborative project or a scope of work that really talks about how do we set up sequencing. It could be answering questions such as a sampling framework, which samples do I sequence, how do I go about selecting these, so on. It could be more about, hey, we have an Illumina system, we also have an MinION, we want to be able to see which to use for which purpose, and to be able to do some comparisons as to where they should be placed and what sequences should go on it. So that is some of the other projects. We also have one with another one of the countries recently, which is on the vaccine sort of vaccine breakthroughs. So really cases very much focused on those, on reinfections and vaccine breakthroughs, being able to sequence those samples and gain insights from there. So some of the key work within this that I'll maybe in the next couple of slides that I will highlight would be, again, when you start off with saying, okay, we know we need to build surveillance capacity. I mean, the data has shown that while there's increased sequencing has been done, there's a lot of disparity in terms of how much sequencing is done across the world, how much coverage is there across the world. Getting like 90% of sequencing for all the positive samples from one country is not as useful as being, and when you still have 0% coverage across other countries. So really being able to get equitable access to sequencing and access to the sequences, of course, the data from these countries is key to be able to have a global sustained response. So I think that's a big part of it. So for that, you can imagine the first place should be to do a baseline. Where is the sequencing capacity today? What is being done? And then really track it over time, which will allow us to identify, when I say us, it would be donors, it could be health systems, health programs itself, countries, as well as implementers to be able to say, okay, these are definitely gaps, or these are sort of zones where there's not much sequencing coming out. Maybe sequencing is happening, maybe it's not being submitted, or maybe there is a need to actually set up better systems to be able to get the sequences to be sampled as was seen in Indonesia. There's a lot of, it could be at the geographic setting that requires a different approach as opposed to a centralized sequencing ability. So these would be some of the different aspects we're working on. So the global capacity map was one that I'll come to after this. And then, as I said, some of this is also about the tools. I think someone had also mentioned, it is expensive to initially set up, right? Expensive in a sense, but when you really talk about it, it is a cost-effective solution, because the more you put on a sequencer, the cheaper it is going to be for the system. The cheaper it's going to be in the long run. So I think it's really important as countries make investments in sequencing to be able to think through what else it will be used for. So it's great that if it can be utilized for COVID-19 today, excellent, it should be. But what else? There's clearly utility beyond this pandemic to be able to continue to be used on a regular basis, so that you can get the maximum out of this investment and the training and everything else that you're putting in to utilize it today. So some of that might also involve making sure the tools itself, the cost of these, there's access to these products, the supply chains that are, if they're broken, to fix them, or if they don't exist in certain places, how do we ensure there is ability to get access to these instruments or reagents or flow cells and so on a regular routine basis in a timely manner.
Sorry, Anita, time is running out.
Sure. No problem. This was just that capacity map that I want to show you. Again, there's a lot of it is more for you to browse. I think when you go on our website, essentially you're seeing the different archetypes in terms of coverage of where sequencing is done, in terms of where the install bases are currently of sequencing, and really you based on sort of the level of sequence. And a lot of this is of course powered by the GISAID data that we work with, so with Rockefeller as well as GISAID to generate this map, right? So I'm sure even if there are different countries represented among the panelists and attendees, you will see there might be certain things that are missing. So we can always, this is something we update on a monthly basis, especially as GISAID, data on GISAID gets updated so rapidly, to ensure that is reflected here, and then to be able to get tailored approaches, tailored sort of solutions for countries where there are gaps, especially for countries, as we said, where still maybe diagnostic capacity is lacking, and that needs to be built first. But there could be countries where there's still some amount of connecting to sequencing centers that's needed, or some amount of leveraging existing sequencing capacity for SARS-CoV-2 sequencing that's needed. Won't go through this since I already described this. Again, a lot of these tools that exist, some of these are costing tools and so on, we're working on. And of course, as I said, individual country programs we'll be happy to speak with to see how we can collaborate or maybe partner to support in some way your sequencing setup and talk through some of your plans for that. So happy to work with us. As I said, our partners on this genomic surveillance working group, we work closely with WHO, Rockefeller Foundation, as well as the several other donors and implementers, including CDC, APHL, and so on. So there's a lot of ongoing work that we can bring to bear to this work. So definitely please give us a shout if you have any questions or interested in support for this, or interested in partnering or learning more about any of our existing or tools that are in development. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anita. Okay, so we conclude the speaker session. Now we will head to the panel discussion. And I'll open up the panel discussion with the first question to Seferina. So I know you already answered on the chat, but maybe for the benefit of those of us who haven't read it yet, can you elaborate how does your institute select the samples for sequencing and the frequency of performing sequencing? Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. So as I already described in one of the slides, that the specimens from travelers, vaccine failures, reinfections, severe illness and death, outbreaks with unusual characteristic, long COVID-19, and cases in children. But we also collect samples and conduct whole genome sequencing from samples from regions that have small number of WGS. Like I mentioned, I showed in the map that some areas still have 3 or 1 or 6 whole genome sequence. So we encourage the province to send samples to institutions that have NGS machines. And as for the frequency, that depends. The most important thing is the reagents availability. As the problem in other countries, Anurag also has mentioned about that, the expensive reagents and scarceness, because we compete all over the world for the reagents, right? Sometimes we have plenty of reagents, sometimes we have to reduce the capacity. And I can only say for the Eijkman Institute that we are lucky to have the high throughput NovaSeq 6,000 machines, only one. It was given by the government early this year, and we were able to use it starting mid-July. So we run about 2 to 4 plates per week, about that. But if the reagent is gone, then we have to reduce it again and use the other machines, the NextSeq 550 and MySeq. We also have those machines. So, and some lab are using also the MinION, and some lab has the GridION, and some lab has ProMethION. But most of the lab in Indonesia has MySeq. So the capacity was about 48 samples to 60 samples per week, if they have the reagents. That's the catch, is if they have the reagents. That's not easy. Thank you. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, that does. Thanks, Seferina. The next question is for Sebastian. Has genomic surveillance helped to better assess vaccine effectiveness? And can you elaborate also about the possibility of escape mutants and the impact that these might have on the reopening up of our economy? I think that's one of the questions that was posed also. Thanks, Sebastian.
Thanks. These are good questions. Of course, you cannot unambiguously say from the genome sequence if the vaccine efficacy will be changed. But there are some indications, as I showed, when you can go from the sequence to the 3D structure, that you know if a mutation has happened where an antibody would normally bind. So what the genomic surveillance has contributed, apart from, of course, the first genomes that were used to make the vaccines, also the early warning of knowing these new variants are there. So when a panel of new variants is being assessed by WHO, by different groups, Public Health England, for example, CEPI, GISAID is working with Public Health England with the Agility Project, where those mutations are highlighted, and then they are being tested. So they go immediately into some molecular tests and to see if there is a potential effect on the vaccine. We also have colleagues in Singapore that were testing the effect of some of these new mutants against antibody binding. And because of the genomic surveillance, we actually could tell this to them early in April that maybe you want to look at that. And this gives you some time to prepare and understand it. By the time it actually becomes big, out of the many different options that are always there, you already have some basic data on those variants. And this is the best we can do currently.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. The next question is for Anurag. We had the question from one of the participants about community testing. I know that you mentioned about nanopore being brought to the airport, but is it possible to bring the sequencing capability even make it more granular to the level of the community? And what is that? Is there any experience, and what has the experience been in India? Thank you.
That's a great question. In fact, when you look at these new machines like Smijan, you ask yourself, will it really make a difference? Can it be brought down to communities? The short answer right now is no, but I'll explain what is the last step remaining. So today we know the sequencing part and the compute part combined with the mobile phone and a small smidgen type device is doable. The missing part of the puzzle is the prep of the sample. So even today, if you wanted to load that smidgen, you would still need frozen reagents, you would need pipettes, you would need basic prep. So if somebody is next able to create an innovation that allows that to be put into a cartridge type processing form, where you put in the sample at one end and something comes out at the other end that is capable of being loaded onto a, yes, we would be there. But looking at the various steps involved, it is not going to be something like the cartridge-based nucleic acid testing. It's going to be something substantially more complex. So the funny thing is to take it to the community. There's going to be a huge amount of hidden complexity. Until then, it won't happen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question is for David, a more clinical-oriented question. The impact of mutations on diagnostics. I think PCR you already alluded to. What about serology and antigen tests? Yeah. David, please.
Yeah, serology and antigen tests are sort of complicated in and of themselves, aside from variants. As we know, tests that measure antigens or measure antibodies don't have sort of the same specificities as nucleic acid tests, but still they're important. And an emerging one is sort of high throughput and point of care tests for antibody assessment. And that, of course, has a very obvious utility because as we get vaccinated and as we come from different at-risk groups with different vaccination histories, we'd like to know what our response has been. And in fact, that's a test that we've decided to go forward with. That is a point of care test that will give us antibody results. As I alluded to, just as a diagnostic test, I think antigen tests are very, very complicated. We're living in scenarios where for symptomatic patients, well, for any patient, what we really see here now is that individuals in our state have grown very, very tired of traveling long distances to get tested, et cetera, et cetera. So they have, by default, and also because of cost containment, resorted to tests like the Binax test. And so understanding those tests very, very well, understanding that in asymptomatic patients, it can be like flipping a coin, understanding in a state that is number 7 in terms of new outbreak cases that use of an antigen test and an antigen test of a given quality may be very, very misleading for guiding the opening of schools, et cetera, et cetera. You know, as soon as we go to antigen testing, we start to see these kinds of problems. And so that's my simple answer to that, as we experience it here.
Okay, thanks, David. Okay, the next question is for Anita. What is the approach to scaling up genomic surveillance? Should we start with small sequencing platforms like the nanopore? Anita, please.
I think Ranurag also mentioned how they set it up in India, but I think definitely, I think that has been a good experience. And along with the countries that we work with, that has been a good way where they've been able to bring in, it depends if they already have access to a MySeq, then they're able to, there's some training or some level that they can already start utilizing, even if it's in a different institute. But the nanopore does have the advantage of being able to very quickly in a small scale startup, sort of low capital costs and so on. So that does allow you to get familiar with the protocols, with being able to handle samples like that and do the sequencing and the data analysis before you start to scale up. And even within MinION, of course, you can do the scale up as Sabrina was mentioning, because it's Promethean, GridION, and so on. Once you decide you're ready for scale, definitely starting with a smaller scale, and then even Illumina has even below the MySeq, the Eijkman instrument that some countries have found very useful to say, again, a lower capital investment depending on the funding availability, and then being able to get the confidence and the sort of standardization before moving up.
Okay, thanks, Anita. The next question is for Prof. Amin. Are you able to share some of the real-world challenges of implementing genomic surveillance from your experience? Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, we started the activity actually, yes, since the very beginning of the pandemic last year. Of course, the challenge is facilities, the human resources, and the availability of reagents. Of course, beyond that, because sequencing is also quite expensive, particularly for Indonesia. Probably if we are talking about whole genome sequencing in Europe or United States, probably the cost is much lower than in Indonesia. But we have to face the reality that importation of reagents as well as equipment is very costly. Sometimes we have to pay 3 to 4 times higher than what our friends in Singapore, Malaysia had to pay for the same stuff. Yeah, that's the challenge. Yeah, we have less fund for that activities, but we have to pay more. Yes, but we are lucky that as Dr. Safarina has mentioned earlier, that in January, the Minister of Research and Technology and also Minister of Health has signed MOU, and yeah, from that understanding, we could get better funding, although also limited. Yeah, it happens not only with Eijkman Institute, but with other institutions. Because so far in Indonesia, there are about a dozen of institutions having a capacity of doing a whole genome sequence. The other institution, we have another 10 institutions. They are actively collecting the samples, but they cannot do the sequencing by themselves. So still they have to send to one of the laboratory. Yeah. So that's the challenge, and also as Anurag and also Dr. Safarina has mentioned, distance is also an important factor. Sometimes samples has to be sent to Jakarta need more than 1 week before we could receive in good condition. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Amin. The next question is for Anurag and Sebastian. What is the accuracy of nanopore sequencing? Maybe Anurag.
Yeah, sure.
Question. Yeah.
There have been nice published papers for SARS-CoV-2 genome sequencing that, except for regions of high complexity, you pretty much have no problem, and almost every part of the SARS-CoV-2 genome can be equally well sequenced by nanopore compared to other methodologies. WHO has taken the same point of view. However, there is a fundamental problem of lower accuracy, which, for example, if I were to do human genome sequencing, I would be worried about. But for viral, bacterial, no problems at all that I can see. Sebastian can perhaps add more.
You captured it well. I can also tell an anecdote. You know, since I was there since the very beginning when the first genomes were shared with GISAID. So the first few were with Illumina, but then one of the fifth one was also with Nanopore. And when we compared it in the genome, a lot of the genomes from Wuhan were fully identical to each other. This included the first genomes of travelers that were detected in Bangkok airport, fully identical over 30,000 bases. But the first nanopore submission that we got had 50 changes, and 50 changes is way too much. Even nowadays, we don't have that many changes happening together after a year of circulation. So we worked with the team, and they looked at it, and this was one of the first submitted nanopore sequences that then was cleaned up and worked. The scientific community has worked on the Arctic protocol that has improved and enabled that nanopore sequencing for SARS-CoV-2 has become also as accurate as Illumina. That's like Anurag said. Now, I would equally take either of them, but it does require constant bioinformatics surveillance if the quality continues to be good.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. This question, I open it up to all the panelists. Are there any sort of early signals of new and potentially nasty variants on the horizon? Yeah, I think that's what we are all most concerned about. Right? Does anyone have any insight into this? Probably not sure if Sebastian, because you monitor the sequences a fair bit.
I think that the best advice is that we should never worry too much about variants, but at the same time, we would always say that also when Alpha came out, someone says, oh, it's spreading faster. When Delta came out, it's spreading faster. The truth is, at the moment when it's new in the world, we do not know it fully, but we have good systems to study them fast, to understand them better as they go on. There are always some changes happening. Delta plus variants, the new sublineages, the AY1 to 12. Many of them are just marker mutation that do not change the spike. Some of them do have these changes, and then they're on the radar and they're in the pipelines to be tested. I think on a positive note, there was a recent study in New England Journal of Medicine by our colleague Linfa from Duke US that has shown that there can be a panzerbecovirus inhibition. So SARS survivors, when they got the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, they got much higher antibody levels. So there is the potential that at some point, when we're exposed enough to either natural infection with different variants or with the vaccine, that we will not need to worry too much about variant as individual immune escape, because our antibody levels could be high enough. But this is something definitely still to watch. But let's hope the virus has positive surprises for us too.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. Okay, and with this, we bring the panel discussion to a close. Thank you to all our speakers again, and I hand it back now to Dr. Sydney Yee. Sydney, over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and the panelists for the very interesting discussions. There are more questions that we didn't get to today, but we'll try to address and post on our ASEAN DX website. I would like to now invite my co-chair of the ASEAN DX initiative, Dr. Jamie Montoya, to give the closing remark. Dr. Montoya is the Executive Director of the Philippines Council for Health Research and Development of the Department of Science and Technology. We can start the closing remark video. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My co-chair, the ASEAN DX Initiative, CEO of the Diagnostics Development Hub, Singapore, Dr. Sydney Yee, our guest speaker, Dr. Amin Soebandrio from the Eijkman Institute, Indonesia, our speakers and panelists from different parts of the globe, Executive Director of the Bioinformatics Institute, A-STAR in Singapore, Dr. Sebastian Morer-Straw, the Director of the Institute of Genomics and Integrative Biology, CSIR in India, the Laboratory Head of the Eijkman Institute in Indonesia, the Head of the Sequencing Program of FIND in Singapore, and Dr. Dave Hilliard from the University of Utah. Thank you for being with us to share your experiences and your insights on next-generation sequencing. To our moderator, Dr. Benedict Yan, thank you for ably navigating us through this apt and relevant discussion. While continues are still scrambling to curb infections due to SARS-CoV-2's Delta variant, a new one emerges yet again. Findings from the study conducted by Kimura et al. Regarding the lambda variant's infectivity and resistance inevitably caused the public concerns especially because these findings are made available for public consumption, without the public knowing the value of these findings being reviewed by their peers. And while ideally within the research community, time is given to referee studies and recommendations before publication, what we could perhaps glean from what is happening at the moment is speedy and timely action and prudent dissemination of information. It's crunch time as we scramble to keep up with the SARS-CoV-2 mutations. There are existing technologies and methods, but our challenge now is how we could make them more accessible and how quickly we could find more effective ways to control infections in the long term. To our friends from the scientific and public health service community, we hope that there are positive takeaways from this forum for all of you. And we hope you could assist us in informing the rest of the world that despite the continuing threats brought about by COVID-19, we are working tirelessly to reach out to our peers from different parts of the world so we can figure out alternatives or bolster our existing solutions. With that hope too comes a wish for responsible data sharing and reporting. From us at the ASEAN DX Initiative again, we thank everyone for accepting our invitation to participate or even just listen. Let's all work together to put a stop to this global pandemic. Have a good day to everyone.
Thank you, Jamie. Indeed, while the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over, globally, we're still trying to eventually evolve into an endemic phase. I guess in the evolution, testing remains key, continue to remain key, but it is not just for purpose of detection, but also for purposes of surveillance and transmission monitoring. It is clear from the discussion today that surveillance can be facilitated in many different ways to make it more accessible. It really depends on the situation in different countries. We hope that the webinar today can help you make connections in terms of support and collaborations that will be sort of fit for purpose for your countries, for your situation. Before we close, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our next session in September, which will be on vaccines and serology. There are quite a number of questions today on vaccines and serology today. The next session should address some of that. So mark your calendar. More details will follow. Finally, we're running a short poll to guide us on other topics of interest to share best practices. Results of the poll will be made available on the ASEAN DX website. Big thank you again to the panelists for taking us to the discussion, and thank you to the participants for staying with us through the discussions as well. We hope to see you in September. Thank you and stay safe.